So good afternoon, everybody. Mary Hunt here at the Water Office with Diane New and Annalie Martin. We are delighted to have you. We greet you with Advent Hope and with Solstice Light this month. We greet you warmly. And we welcome you to the December 9th, 2020 Water Talk, Letha Scanzoni and Friends Building Bridges, a book by Kendra Weddle and Jann Aldredge-Clanton. We'll discuss it today, and it's a wonderful group of people gathered to do this because many of you are among the friends mentioned in the title of the book. And so I think it always helps to have that kind of reality when we have these discussions. We had hoped that Letha Scanzoni could be with us, but she sent her regrets. And so we greet her in absentia and thank her profusely for the work that she continues to do for so many. It's wonderful to have the Evangelical and Ecumenical Women's Caucus, now called Christian Feminism Today, here with Water. We are sister groups, and we are among the few sister groups who bring feminist, religious, and spiritual values to bear for social and ecclesial change. And I guess we better say we are sibling groups, because that's really a more accurate description of us in the 21st century. Welcome to each and every one of you. Let us dedicate this session to the memory of our beloved friend and colleague, Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, who died recently. Virginia was the co-author with Letha Scanzoni of the landmark book, Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? A Positive Christian Response. I was recently researching a very short encyclopedia entry about Virginia for an encyclopedia of something about the Bible. I don't know, it was rather out of my ken, but anyway, they asked me to write a very short entry on Virginia and especially her impact on biblical studies. And so I was rereading her life and some of her work. And when I reread, and because I've read now twice our book for today, when I reread our book for today, I was struck by the parallels between these two friends' lives, especially as they were both in some ways persona non grata in the evangelical circles from which they came and for which they provided so much scholarship and wisdom. And I couldn't help but think what a loss this has been to the evangelical Christian community to shun them both. And hence we lift them up here with deep gratitude and with reverence. Like all of Water's efforts, this session is not simply an academic seminar, but a way to learn in order to bring our learning to the creation of a more just and equitable world. At this liminal time in world history, it's helpful, at least to me, to have role models like Virginia and Letha. While we may not agree with them on everything, their lives and their efforts provide light and inspiration. And note also, as I alluded to earlier, that the title of this book is Letha Scanzoni and Friends, reminding us that we are never alone in this work, or if we are alone, we probably won't survive very long. So it's with great delight that we at Water recognize and share this time with CFT, friends in the struggle for justice. A warm welcome to you all. There's a regular format for these Water Talks. I will introduce the speakers who will have 20 or 25 minutes to say something about their work. It's not a lot of time, but plenty, I think, for these two very competent women to give us a sense of this book. And then there will be time for dialogue and for questions and discussion. We invite you to just sit back and listen and enjoy. We will take notes on this, and the notes and the audio will be on, perhaps the video this time, I don't know, will be on our website shortly after our guests have a quick look at them for accuracy or to add something we might have missed. So if somebody mentions a URL or a title, we'll try to get those into the notes so you don't have to scramble now to get that yourself. Let me say too that Annalie will see to it that our audio is muted so that we'll cut down on noise and assure a clear line for the presentation. But when our speakers finish, you'll be invited to participate in the conversation. At any time during the hour, please feel free to use the chat function and to give us your ideas or your feedback or to make comments in the chat. We'll take from the chat too for conversation. This program will end at 2 o'clock Eastern time, which is the top of the hour after you arrived. That respects everybody's schedules, but our work will not be done. You can listen or point other people to the teleconference on our website at water.org. which is at www.waterwomensalliance.org. Look under programs and teleconferences. And what you'll find is a picture of our speakers, as well as icons both for the audiovisual as well as for the notes. And that allows people who have different learning styles to avail themselves of this opportunity. So with that, let me introduce our speakers and we will move to our discussion. Jann Aldredge-Clanton is a feminist theologian and an ordained minister. She serves as co-chair of the group Equity for Women in the Church, which according to their mission statement is an ecumenical movement to facilitate equal representation of clergy women as pastors of multicultural churches in order to transform church and society. Jann is an adjunct professor at Richland College and co-leader of New Wineskins Community. Her many and popular books include Praying with Christ Sophia, Seeking Wisdom, Changing Church, and Earth Transformed with Music, just to mention a few. So Jann, a special welcome to you. It's so nice to have you at Water. And then our second speaker will be Kendra Weddle, who is an associate professor and chair of religion and humanities at Texas Wesleyan University. She focuses there on the intersection of gender and religion. She's the co-author with Melanie Springer Mock of If Eve Only Knew, and she's the author of Preaching on the Plains. Kendra, we're so glad to have you here at Water. It's great to have you in action. We have a little page on our website called What We're Reading, and every 2 months we put up blurbs of books that we are reading, things that we want to promote. And here's what we wrote about building bridges. Letha Dawson-Scanzoni gives evangelical feminism vitality and integrity as an extension of her own. This vividly written biography, based on texts, interviews, and reflections by colleagues, tells the story of a woman who, with her friends, created new spaces and new ideas that are still transforming an important sector of the Christian community. Their words have been read and heeded before, but now there's no excuse for not crossing the bridge to justice and equality. So welcome to you both as we build our own bridges among us as feminists in religion. Jann and Kendra.
Thank you so much, Mary. We're really grateful to be with you all today, and we very much appreciate Water and the opportunities that we have to collaborate together. So thank you for inviting us to join in your discussion today. So I think we have a PowerPoint that's coming up. We wanted to share just a little bit about the book and about Letha as kind of a prelude into some discussion for us later. This happens to be a picture with Letha, you can see on the left. And this was taken at the CFT conference that we had in 2018. And we thought it would be a great way to start by just giving you a snapshot of the three of us as we celebrated shortly after the book was published. What we wanted to do with the book was that we wanted to tell the story of Letha, but we also wanted to ensure that this was a feminist biography. And what we meant by a feminist biography was that it would not stop with the person, so in this case with Letha, but we wanted to be able to show that the work and the legacy that Letha created continues on and has these ongoing circles of influence. And so our approach then was to not only tell the story of Letha, but then also to interview lots of people who have been influenced by her and to share some of their stories and ways in which her work helped them or influenced them. And one of the things that we saw early on when we turned our attention to Letha and then started listening to these stories of people was that justice was very much at the center of everything. And this was the, I would say, kind of the crux of Letha's work, specifically with feminism, and then also with LGBTQ persons. And this, you can see, ripples out with the people and what they have to say about Letha throughout the book.
As Kendra mentioned, Building Bridges includes narratives of many people influenced by Letha's life and work. In the introduction, we include our stories of transformation. When I was teaching English at Dallas Baptist University, I read All We're Meant to Be, a biblical approach to women's liberation. This photo on the left is from when I was teaching at DBU. Although I'd claimed my professional vocation, I had never questioned biblical interpretations that prescribe the subordination of women at home and at church. But as I read All We're Meant to Be, I discovered more than enough biblical support for gender equality. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had come out more than 10 years before, but I'd never heard of the book nor raised any questions about women's traditional roles. The call to gender justice could reach me only through the Bible. All We're Meant to Be transformed my life with new revelations from the Bible. Letha and Nancy gave such thorough, convincing biblical support for gender equality in all areas of life that I became an instant convert and a passionate evangelist for these new truths I'd learned. I bought copies of All We're Meant to Be and gave them to the leaders of our Baptist church, all men. I believe that the copious scriptural evidence and the clear theological reasoning that had so thoroughly convinced me of the rightness of women's equality would persuade them as well. I soon learned otherwise. Growing up, I never saw a woman in the pulpit except a missionary to Nigeria, and what she did was called speak, not preach. The messages I got from my church and culture were that women could be missionaries, teachers, or nurses, but certainly not pastors. When I read All We're Meant to Be, a new world of possibilities opened for me. Because I found in this book such compelling biblical support for women as church leaders, my self-perception began to change. Even though I delighted in my teaching vocation, now I could see myself in other ministries as well. So I was receptive when the call came to pastoral ministry that soon included social justice activism and writing on gender equality. In this photo on the right, I'm in the pulpit of 7th and James Baptist Church in Waco, Texas, after my ordination. The more I tried to live out my pastoral call, the more I realized that the resistance to women's ordination is just part of a larger culture that gives greatest value to white, heterosexual, able-bodied, financially privileged males. I came to understand that at the foundation of this culture is the image of a male God sanctioning patterns of dominance and submission. The suggestion in All We're Meant to Be that God could be more than male planted a seed that would bloom into writing on expanding divine imagery, and then into hymns, liturgies, and stories that can include biblical female names and images of deity. As I mine scripture for inclusive divine images of justice things, All We're Meant to Be provided a model of responsible biblical interpretation. The foundation of Letha and Nancy's interpretation is the liberating justice message of Jesus.
So we wanted to share with you just a few key points from Letha's life, although there's more obviously in the book. But just to give you a brief overview, she was born in 1935 in Pennsylvania, and she grew up largely in kind of small rural communities. with her parents, and she has one brother. And one of the things that she talks about as being important in her young years is nature. And she used to spend lots of time out in the woods. And she remarks about the beauty of the sky and the trees as being key elements in confirming for her early on her sense of God's love. And so that was a very vital point or part of her early years. Letha also was involved somewhat in church when she was young, although this wasn't a prominent aspect because her parents had family businesses that they were running. They were always very busy, of course, on Sundays. And so she attended church with a friend on occasion, but it wasn't kind of the central organizing aspect of her life. And she got instead the sense of love from nature. But as part of her young life, she took up music and she became a trombone player. And that maybe is kind of part of her early feminism, was that she chose a trombone as her instrument of choice. And so she became very well known for playing the trombone. She wasn't just kind of a mediocre student. For those of you who maybe know Letha, she goes all in, and she did that with this. And she told me that there were times when she would go to her father's shop when he was fixing cars, and she would practice for hours and hours out in the shop. So she became quite adept at the trombone. And so she had this dream because of her skill at playing the trombone and also her interactions with some fairly well-known musicians at the time. She had this dream that she wanted to have a band, and that would be how she would live her life, is traveling around with her band. And so the reason then that we have the next piece of In His Steps by Charles Sheldon is because while she had this dream in the back of her mind that was kind of driving what she thought she was going to do, she also came across this book, In His Steps, when she was in high school. And this book changed the trajectory of her life. And she says that even still, she kind of returns to this book as being a really pivotal point for her. It was at this juncture that she read this book, and in the book, there's a story of a female musician. And so she connected with that person in her mind. And it was at this point that she shifted her thinking to envisioning how she could use her music for spreading the gospel. And so kind of the shift for her was moving from music being something on its own to music being a way to share the love of God with others. So she ended up deciding then to go to Eastman School of Music. And she did so in part because it was known for having well-known trombonists and obviously musicians at the school. I should say too that early on, Letha had the opportunity to rub shoulders with very well-known musicians. And in fact, I was looking at kind of a reflection that she noted when she was 16, and she had just gone to see show with by Fred Waring. And in that show, she, of course, she enjoyed watching it, but afterwards she had the opportunity to talk with him. And she wasn't shy and immediately struck up a conversation with him about her music. And even in that conversation, she explored what he thought she should do in terms of college. So anyway, she also reached out to other well-known people and asked them what they thought. And she ended up deciding to go to Eastman. So as you can see, she went to Eastman for a couple of years. And while she was at Eastman, she was continuing to process this idea of what we would call a calling, right? How she was going to put together her music with spreading this message of love of God. And so it was while she was at Eastman that she saw in a magazine an advertisement for Moody. And in this advertisement, it was pointing to the possibility of studying without tuition payments. And her family was struggling financially at the time, and this seemed like a good way to continue her education. And so she ended up transferring to Moody. And so she attended Moody for a couple of years. After that, we're fast forwarding about 10 years. She's now married, has a couple young boys. And she was a regular reader of Eternity magazine. And she noted in one of the magazines an article that really kind of was troubling to her in terms of the assumptions about women. And so she decided to write a letter to the editor about this article. And so she sat down to write this article on her typewriter. And she says that she realized that she had about 300 words and she wasn't done. And so it was at that point she realized she didn't have a letter to the editor, she had an article. And so she ended up publishing that article in Eternity. And that article was called Woman's Place, Silence or Service. That led to a second article also in Eternity, which was called Elevate Marriage to Partnership. I might just say, we don't have time to talk about it here, but in our book, we share also how just in the process of editing these articles, Letha kind of met the challenge of some of the patriarchal assumptions of the editors. But nevertheless, these articles kind of set the path for her as a writer. She also then, over time, became part of Evangelicals for Social Action. She wasn't at their initial meeting, but she was there in the second year, along with Nancy Hardesty. She and Nancy Hardesty, who was the co-author of All We're Meant to Be, they initially started writing each other after the Eternity articles came out. So it was through those articles that she and Nancy then kind of became acquainted. That acquaintance grew as they were part of Evangelicals for Social Action, which continued to kind of form the basis of their work. They ended up deciding that they had a book together, and so they wrote All We're Meant to Be, which as many or most of you know, became quite the watershed book. Christianity Today in 2006 identified it as one of the top 50 books influencing evangelicals. And in 2010, it was listed as one of the top 100 books that should or will create Christian culture. And one of the, again, as we mentioned, justice as the integrating aspect for Letha, we wanted to pull out this notation where they say that we became convinced that Jesus Christ set us free. So this idea of justice and liberation very much at the center of Letha's work. Letha then was also part of co-founding the Evangelical Women's Caucus, which now is called Christian Feminism Today. And that is a group that came from out of Evangelicals for Social Action. So that's the connection with that group. And then over time, as the Evangelical Women's Caucus grew, and also as Letha's awareness of other people within evangelical circles grew, and also as her reputation expanded, that was how she and Virginia came into contact with one another. And they ended up then writing, of course, Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? This was supposed to be a book about ethics. That was their original intent. And so Letha decided to write the chapter on sexuality. And when she sent that chapter to Virginia and Virginia read it, Virginia got back to her immediately and said, okay, we have a book about this. And so that is how they ended up writing Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? This is the first part of the book, is this expanded biography of Letha. But that's not the whole story. And we wanted to show how Letha and her work has expanded and influenced other people. So that's the second part of the book.
Yes, the second part draws from the interviews that Kendra mentioned with a diverse group of people influenced by Letha's life and work, including Mary Hunt. She comments on the impact of Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? Letha and Virginia's collaboration on Is the Homosexual My Neighbor remains one of the happiest joint projects in the history of theology. I love that quote. She goes on to say, this work had world-shaping impact. Mary tells the story of meeting Letha in 1982 at a women's spirit bonding conference and discovering the similarity between evangelicals and Catholics in the struggle for gender and LGBTQ justice. Mary says she felt a kinship with her evangelical sisters and the importance of feminists of all faiths working together. Jeff Luke begins his story. Letha Danzoni made me break one of the commandments. I was compelled by her work to commit a crime that altered the trajectory of my life for the better. Jeff grew up in a Southern Baptist church in Kentucky, where his mother was a Sunday school teacher and his father a deacon, and Jeff was active in all the youth activities. In his conservative religious and social circle, he knew he had to keep his sexual orientation hidden. In graduate school, when he was completing his psychology practicum and struggling terribly, he says, to reconcile his faith and sexuality, he saw Is the Homosexual My Neighbor in his supervisor's office. He didn't want to ask to borrow the book because at that time he wasn't ready to come out. So one day when his supervisor got called away, Jeff snatched the book, planning to read it that night and return it the following day. But he was never able to find the right circumstance to return the book unnoticed. Now Jeff treasures his stolen copy of Is the Homosexual My Neighbor and says, in no small part because of Letha Dawson-Scanzoni, I've been able to express my sexuality in ways that are loving and affirming. There will be no hurdle for me at the pearly gates, assuming that I can atone for that one act of unrepented larceny. Is the Homosexual My Neighbor inspired Peggy Campola to become one of the most powerful LGBTQ activists, even for many years in opposition to her husband, Tony, a well-known evangelical author, speaker, and sociology professor. After reading Is the Homosexual My Neighbor and realizing that Letha had risked everything to take such a brave stand, Peggy became a frequent pro-LGBTQ speaker to church and campus groups around the country, often serving on panels with her husband, who took an opposing view. She says that the book Letha wrote with Virginia was one of the things that gave her courage to speak out against the grave injustices being done by the church to LGBTQ people. Kimberly George talks about how relevant All We're Meant to Be is to her 30-something, her 20-something generation, even though written before she was born. She says, I felt as though women in my generation were trying to recreate the wheel because we didn't realize our elders had gone before us and already done this brave writing. Womanist minister Leslie Harrison affirms Letha's influence. Letha has given me strength to flex my muscles as a confident, strong African-American woman. When I read, Leslie says that when she read All We're Meant to Be, she found herself in the pages and could hear Letha's voice and feel her passion, wisdom, and commitment to social justice for all. Letha is still building bridges between generations, between feminism and womanism, and between biblical interpretation and liturgy. I'm going to play a song video that illustrates Letha's influence of her work on my writing of lyrics for liturgy. Since we're in Advent season, I chose one of my songs set to a familiar carol tune.
Sing of peace.
Okay,
Thank
now
you both so very much.
we're open
Really,
for Q&A.
we really appreciate what you have shared with us this afternoon. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move us to the question and answer, our discussion period, if that's okay with you two.
Yes.
There'll be plenty of time for you to say more as we go, but I want to include our many participants in this. And again, thank you very much to Kendra Weddle and to Jann Aldredge-Clanton for building bridges, Letha Scanzoni and Friends. And the book is available from Cascade Books in Eugene, Oregon. It was published in 2018. And I think you can see after hearing from our authors why I'm enthusiastic about this book, because I do think it brings to light many parallels with other movements of women in other religious traditions around the world. And that's very, very helpful by lifting up not only one person, but a group of people responding and working with her. I think you've accomplished something very important. And I thank you on behalf of all of us for that. So now the floor is open. Jeanette Stokes from the Center for Women in Ministry in the South, another one of the sibling groups, another sibling group. Jeanette Stokes, welcome.
Thank you. Hey, Mary. Jann and Kendra, thank you so much for this book. I'm ashamed to say I did not know it. And Jann, thank you for speaking. My people are from Texas, and it's great to hear your accent. I lived in Greensboro in the 1980s, where John Scanzoni was on the faculty at UNC Greensboro. I was a campus minister and eventually got to know Letha. We gave out Is the Homosexual My Neighbor by the dozens to students and occasionally distressed parents. Gave them out from the Presbyterian Student Center. We were sort of the religious group on campus that was welcoming and affirming. And so it was a real gift to have it. But Letha was so modest that she let the public think it was really Virginia's book. And in conversations with her, she never said, the whole thing was because, like Mary Hunter, I would have said, excuse me, but we were the inspiration for X, Y, or Z. So she was very, very modest. She came to some of our programs, but never made a big deal of herself. And over the years, I was so inspired by her work and Virginia's and Nancy's and the work of the Evangelical Women's Caucus that they turned and spoke back into the community from which they had come. And their work, Letha's work, and Virginia and Nancy's, was such a great resource to those of us who thought of ourselves as from more progressive branches of Christianity, because most of the people in our pews were of the same mindset, and so it spoke to them. So thank you so much. The stories of the lives of people like Letha can just get lost unless someone saves them. So thank you from myself and for prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette, for that. I might just respond briefly to say this has been one of the things that has amazed me about Letha, and I was surprised. I didn't realize the extent, but when you think about the number of people today in evangelical circles who now are willing to step forward and say, okay, yes, I'm willing to affirm LGBTQ persons as persons of faith. If you set that next to what Letha was willing to do, and I say Letha because she didn't have anything to gain from it. I mean, and so she was giving up any kind of place within the evangelical world, and this was not going to have any kind of positive effect for her personally, and instead was going to cost her everything personally. And that is in fact what happened. And so that's just one of the things that has really stayed with me, is kind of that willingness to step out there and be courageous and recognize what it would cost, and to do so. And then, as you say, to do so without wanting to take any kind of credit for it. it seemed to me like very much a prophetic person and action. So thank you for recognizing that, Jeanette.
Right. If I can say one follow-up thing, I remember most clearly her outrage when John left. I don't think it was a mutual agreement for the two of them. And she was just like agog that he would, because I think their marriage had a faith component to it, and it, you know, was real important. And he also wrote some about family and sexuality. And anyway, and but that she never, I mean, she was outraged, but there was never clear blame either for her progressive stances or anything he had done. Or, I mean, she just had, even in her angriest, she was trying to make room for the spirit and for love and for justice and for peace. It was really remarkable to watch. And it was just an accident that we were both living in Greensboro at the same time.
If I could just add a little footnote here for people who are not as familiar with these people and with this history, which I think is many of us in this session, that all we're meant to be, the book that she wrote with Nancy Hardesty came out in 1974, before some of you were born, and also was revised in 1986. And then the book Is the Homosexual My Neighbor came out in 1978 and was later revised when Virginia Raymond Walcott came out as a lesbian. So there was, you know, here you had a book written as if the two authors were sexuality unknown, and then Virginia came out, and so as they wrote the revision of that, it took on a new hue, as it were. But I think that Jeanette, the interpersonal questions that you're raising there are handled in a very, I think, forthright way in the book. So again, thanks to Jann and Kendra for how they handled that in the book. There was no secret about the fact that Letha was not happy about the end of their marriage, and that she had many feelings about it, especially raising questions about her own beliefs. And many women, I think, as I said at the beginning, don't blame yourself. You know, there are lots of things that go on that are not our fault, and that's something to take away. The floor is open. Mary Grace.
Jann, I've read your book, She Who Is, and I was so impressed with the gift that you have for taking hymns or songs and putting them into a feminine space. And I'm just wondering if what we just saw, your gift for revising Silent Night, is available someplace that we might be able to use it or see it in our communities.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary. And Mary Hunt, you can put this in the
You'll put it in the notes.
Yeah. They're all out there free on my YouTube channel, JannAldredge-Clanton.com. If you just go to YouTube and put in the search my name. And I do want to still give credit to Letha for beginning this, and from this to see the trajectory of Kendra's work, co-authoring with Melanie Springer-Mock, If Eve Only Knew, and Rita is on here, and Rita Finger, and Ann Linslider, and other CFT. All of this came from Letha's work. By the way, we entered them in the book too, but I couldn't have quotes from everybody, but I have wonderful stories from Ann and Rita in the book. And New Wineskins community that we have in Dallas now. All of this has emerged, and I think so many people in the book who tell their stories, and countless others out there, this has come from Is the Homosexual My Neighbor and All We're Meant to Be. By the way, Virginia gives Letha credit for coming up with that name, Is the Homosexual My Neighbor. And remember, Kendra, what she says about how apt that title is? I think Virginia said, well, that would really bother the conscience of evangelicals with a title like that.
would make it very difficult to dismiss.
Yeah.
Well, she was very successful, which really prompts me to ask you a question. How have you seen over the long period of time the reception of feminism in the evangelical community? It's a broad question and it's a big community, but I can say from the Catholic end of things that we have seen several things that have happened, and one of which is more virulence on the part of those in leadership, namely the Vatican. They're more angry than ever. More variety among women, and some women quite willing to collaborate with clerics who oppose the idea. They say, well, working inside the institution, working inside in a corrupt institution is something somebody has to do. So I'm just wondering if have you seen something parallel there with evangelical women and the reception or non-reception of feminism in evangelical circles? Has it gotten worse or better?
I think it's kind of a mixed bag. I think currently we're in a period of where I think it's probably mostly worse. Of course, the early feminists were really evangelical in the sense that they would often talk about some kind of a conversion experience. They took the Bible very seriously. Piety was very much a part of their lives. And it was from that perspective that they did their justice work. And I think then that evangelicals through the years have been willing to kind of go back and in some cases celebrate those perhaps individuals, but maybe celebrate kind of an idea here or there. But I think there's fear when the kind of idea of liberation perhaps extends beyond where they might want it to go. So in terms of if my understanding and commitment to liberation and justice means that in some way I need to re-envision some things, then there is kind of a barrier. And that is, of course, what Letha and Nancy saw with All We're Meant to Be, and of course what Letha and Virginia saw with Is the Homosexual My Neighbor. There are boundaries that cannot be transgressed.
And a high price to pay for transgressing them. Yes. Sherry has a question. Go ahead, Sherry. Sherry, can you unmute, please?
There. I just had to figure out how to do it. Hey guys, I really enjoy being part of the conference here. And I have a question, please, that builds on your comments, Dr. Hunt and Miss Weddle. As Kendra was noting, there is a very long history of evangelical women fighting for social justice and using that really as a platform into the pulpit. And I understand from what I've been listening to that it appears that the pulpit is still largely inaccessible, or my question is, has the pulpit become more accessible to women today, given our history of intercession of evangelical women fighting to get this right? Where do we stand today? Where do women who aspire to the pulpit stand today to gain access? Are we more accepted, less? How is the battle going?
Jann, Kendra, would you like to reply?
I'll just chime in with equity for women in the church that Mary mentioned in the introduction. Our goal is to facilitate receptivity of as pastors. It hasn't gotten very much better. Now, there are some groups that it has, like Alliance of Baptists, they're Baptists and they're Baptists, just like they're Catholics and they're Catholics, as you know. And the Alliance of Baptists has been open and affirming almost from the beginning, and promoting women as pastors. And so now about 30% of the pastors in Alliance of Baptists are women, but that is an exception. In Southern Baptist Life, of course, they're almost non-existent. In other evangelical traditions, and even in mainline traditions, we found that only about 10% of pastors are women. So as Kendra mentioned, it's both and. Some things have gotten better, but it's still quite a struggle, particularly for clergy women of color, to find pulpits, because in the particularly the Black tradition, the Black church tradition, the male pastor has been so predominant in civil rights and everything. And so they've had trouble within the Black church tradition, and some predominantly white churches have called women of color. That's why we say we're wanting also to break down this white church and Black church and have multicultural churches. And we believe that will open up more opportunities for clergy women.
Thanks so much. Other questions? Who would like to raise a question? Let's see some. You can also, this is an old-fashioned way to do it. Put your hand up if you want to. Diane New?
You know, I've been scanning the pictures on this Zoom, and I'm amazed at who is on this call. And I just want to raise up the power of prophetic persistence that is right here. I look at Women in Ministry in the South, Jeanette Stokes. I look at Evangelical Women's Caucus, Christian Feminism Today. I noted, of course, let's put water there. There are women church people and organizations on this call, women priests, women with dignity. There are ordained women on this call, and there are the faithful ones that are doing this work every day, every minute. And there are also countries represented on this call. I see Germany and Canada and Ireland and the United States, just to mention a few. There are authors on this call. It's an amazing group. And I think we have to raise up and give ourselves thanks for continuing to do the work. Let me just say, there are musicians on this call, oh my. There are authors on this call, story writers on this call, and on and on and on. The patriarchy has tried to silence us, and we have continued to speak our voices because of people like Letha and Virginia, and I can add Rosemary Ruther and Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza and all the women leaders in all of our traditions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Diane. Good insights. Cindy Lapp in the chat is asking a question I'd like to pose to our authors. In the evangelical churches, Cindy Lapp, by the way, is the pastor of the Hyattsville Mennonite Church here in Hyattsville, Maryland, a dear friend and longtime collaborator here at Water. And she asks, in the evangelical churches where women are pastors, are they identifying as feminists? Are they bringing the next generation along?
Well,
any thoughts on that
question?
might be other people on the call who'd like to raise who'd like to answer that, but I think it's
I think that would be great to hear from others on the call who
because I think we all know what she's referring to, that there are that many of us who are feminist identified are the ones who have paved the way, made the space, opened the doors, and the ones who've sailed in behind us. It's sort of like watching the elections and seeing this spate of Republican women coming into the Congress, now that women can be in government. Now, this is the question, what kinds of women are they, and what do we learn from that? Anybody? Cindy herself might want to comment. Please go ahead.
Well, I think it was telling that there was a quote up on the screen from a young woman who said, "We didn't know that our elders, that the elders had already done this work." And I think I'm amazed when I am at women's conferences, when the women my age and middle age look at the young women that are there and say, "Oh my gosh, good, the young women are here." And the young women look at women my age and they say, "Oh, wow, look at all you old women that are doing this work. We didn't know." So somehow we have to figure out how to connect with each other and continue to support each other across the generations and claim the language.
Yeah, very helpful. Anybody else like to opine on this one? I think it's terribly important.
I think there are a lot of younger women who have no clue the knowledge that's in this on this screen right now. I am totally shocked at young women in church who have absolutely no clue of the struggle that all of these authors and have led us to. They take, and if there is any ordained women in their fellowships or whatever, they totally take it for granted. They don't know the struggle that it took to get them there. It just blows my mind anyways.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we have to do is not blame young women and not blame old women, but to look at the systems and the way in which they have been recalcitrant in terms of allowing us to bring these materials into the mainstream, for example, of theological education. That's where the gap is. That's why if you have women, yeah, go ahead, Kendra, please.
I might also just say that this is a great example of how Letha built a bridge. And so you can find, there's a blog that she had with a young woman, and the blog's called 7227, and it's located on the EEWC CFT website. And it came about because there was a young woman, Kimberly George, who had contacted Letha, and out of that contact and extended conversation happened. And Letha saw in that the opportunity for them to have a cross-generational blog that would address the issues of faith and feminism. And that's an excellent illustration of kind of not throwing up our hands at this challenge of a gap, an age gap, and instead kind of taking some kind of proactive stance and being able to kind of use that to the benefit of everyone. So I would encourage people to read 7227 and
thank you. We'll make sure that it's in the notes. Barbara, we have time for a very quick comment, and then I'm going to close our session, and then people are welcome to stay on and chat. So Barbara, if you can make, yours is in the chat, but if you want to make a quick comment.
Thank you, Mary. I was going to say that young women, old women, women around the world, it has been a patriarchal lens, and it's not just one lens, one country, and this is our focus, but it's worldwide, and it has it's very important.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why one of the great things that's come out of the COVID pandemic for us at Water has been the expansion of our programs with an international reach. And so we are always delighted to have folks from all over the world with us. I regret that I have to end the session simply because the time is up, but the conversation is by no means over. Please feel free to stay and to chat as you will. Let me thank Kendra and Jann one more time. It has just been a very rich hour of sharing. It has flown by. We are in your debt for this excellent book. And Building Bridges, Letha Dawson-Scanzoni and Friends is available on Amazon and through the publisher. I highly recommend it as a way of understanding how one particular group of feminists has done this work and what it portends for the rest of us. All of our programs at Water are free and open to everyone. Everyone is invited. Your donations to Water are needed and welcome, but it is our view that if we socialize resources, so those who can donate do, and those who can't don't feel any difference, we know that if we share, there will be enough. So we always make water programs available to everyone without charge, and we hope to continue to be able to do that through your generosity. And if you are not able, if your circumstances do not allow you, don't think a thing about it. Go on with your good work. Best wishes from Water for the holidays, and special wishes for good health to you and to our planet. We look forward to meeting again in January of 2021 for another Water Talk. Thank you very much and have a great day. For those who'd like to stay, you're welcome. So just stay and continue conversation. Cindy, great question. Jeanette Stokes, wonderful to see you.
Thank you. Did the authors, oh, Kendra's
Yeah,
still
they're here. They're with us.
Okay.
Kendra and Jann, please go ahead.
I'm interested in the publishing process. The Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South publishes books often because the authors don't think they can find a publisher. So can you say something about how you got to Cascade and how that went?
Yeah. Thank you, Jeanette, and appreciate all the work that you're doing there. I've known about your work. I meant to say that for a long time. Wipf and Stock, Cascade is one of the imprints of Wipf and Stock, and they're very receptive to books that might not be just bestsellers. Of course, we want our book to be a bestseller.
Yes.
Which will be one day, but they see the content, particularly of theological books, religious books, and they market a lot to religious faith-based universities and seminaries, but then they a wide audience as well. And Cascade is the imprint that they do the most in marketing, and they give the best services as far as copy editing. So I would suggest Wipf and Stock. I'm sure there are other publishers,
Yes.
but yeah.
So did you ask others or did you go straight to them? What are you holding, Mary? He's holding the latest publication of the Resource Center, Sideways, which is Illusions of Innocence, which is a book that was published on the December the 1st that we published. It's a white woman's journey to understand race in America and in her family. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So did you ask other publishers or did you go straight to them?
Kendra had, what was your publisher for If Eve Only Knew? And for my book, She Lives, Skylight Paths, we went to them. And we went to, I think we went to Westminster, John.
Yep. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm glad they responded immediately. They've been really great with people. Wipf and Stock has the people that I know. Yeah. Good. Thank you. I'm always interested in.
Have you published with Wipf and Stock, Jeanette?
No, one of my colleagues has. We actually publish books at the Resource Center, so I take the short road.
Well, that's good that y'all are publishing. Yeah,
That's the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South, and it is, as I said, a sibling group of ours. It's in Durham, North Carolina, and we can put that in the notes so that we'll have a little link to them as well. Jeanette's been at it a long time in a faithful way, so with great results. Anybody else?
You know, I was
Yeah,
thinking,
go ahead. Yeah, great to have you.
When the question came up about younger women, or the statement that younger women are surprised that older women are here, and younger women tend to take for granted their freedoms in the church, that it strikes me that that's a wonderful sign that the work some of those ahead of us and some of us did worked. But the only concern would be that taking position in the church for granted wouldn't allow a gradual narrowing again of opportunity for women. And I was thinking back to when I entered seminary in 1970. I arrived at seminary just assuming I could do this, because by some miracle, my rather moderate evangelical church had never questioned my calling to do this. And then I got to Princeton Seminary and found that the attitude among the male students, at least, was, well, why are the few of you here? But once you find husbands, you won't have any great need to be here any longer. You know, and it took me like 24 hours to become just a raving feminist because I had never encountered such idiocy before. But so when I was ordained in 72, 73, women had been ordained in the Presbyterian Church for a couple of decades, but I was number 123. And even the ordination certificate still had all male pronouns that somebody had to cross out by hand and write in her and so on. Some years back, I checked again, and there were 15 or 16,000 of us at least. And now it's probably up over 20, 25,000. So I'm glad that younger women now can take for granted, at least in some denominations, that we belong here. And I'm all for the struggles of Catholic women still to get heard and placed, and other evangelical women. So still there is work to do.
Yeah, I so identify with what you just said, Gail. At Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, I was one of two women in my homiletics class, and they videoed our sermons, and the males in the class were very critical, not of my content, but they said my delivery was affected. And the teacher, male, to his credit, said, "How many of you have ever heard a woman preach?" And none of them had. So anyway, then my ordination certificate did have she and her at 7th and James, but I was licensed to preach first at Cliff Temple Baptist Church in Dallas, and it all male pronouns. But the question somebody asked a while back about are the pastors feminist? What bothers me is that inclusive language seems to be not an issue anymore for some. In fact, I have a clergywoman friend who says that her students, she's a supervised ministry professor at Perkins, and she said some of her younger students have said, well, that was important back when you were struggling to be ordained, but we don't need it anymore. Well, you know, not realizing the foundation and also just the hierarchical structures and so much of patriarchy that's embedded. And of course, the masculine images of God I see as foundational to patriarchy. And if we're going to dismantle patriarchy, then we've got to do something about that. And of course, that's been my calling, but I'm discouraged that so many, when I see a woman in the pulpit and hear her using all masculine references to God, and the hymns all male in her congregation, I just think, well, what is the message that she's giving?
Yeah, that was the heart of Cindy Lapp's question that I was trying to probe a little bit, that in fact the doors have been opened for women who will do that as the price, even, or maybe they don't know any better, but they will certainly do that as the price of their ministry. I just wonder what you think about that, or how you know, what you see, like in the Presbyterian Church, Gail. I mean, there must be people in that. I know people in that situation in Presbyterian Church that women who don't use inclusive language, who don't have feminist views.
Yeah. Well, in my teaching, in preaching classes, since today's program, which was wonderful, by the way, thank you so much. Since this was in memory of Virginia Mollenkott, I always quoted something Virginia had said about language, which is that the human mind is exceedingly literal. And so when the person hears God referred to as he, what the mind, in spite of ourselves, pictures is a male God. And when believers are referred to in masculine terms, what the mind pictures is all masculine believers and leaders. So, you know, language is important. And in the Presbyterian Church, we've come a long way in terms of ordained, but I think there still is work to do. When I entered seminary, I had only ever seen one ordained woman. She was a 60-year-old woman in the United Church of Canada, where our college symphonic band toured one spring and played in their church. And she was an assistant pastor to a much younger man, but that was the only ordained woman I had ever seen. 3 years later, a month before my graduation from seminary, I went to a service on campus where a woman minister officiated in the Eucharist. And it was the first time I had ever seen a woman serve communion, and I couldn't stop weeping. It was so moving to me, and I was almost out of seminary at that point. So just the presence of all of us and the language, I think, is still so important for what the human mind registers when it sees and hears.
Right. As Mary Hunt once said, you can't just add women and stir.
Yes.
That
Famously, she said it famously.
our presence does change things, but I've noticed less insistence on inclusive language. One example is I went to a service a couple of years ago at Duke Chapel, which is not very Methodist, but sort of Methodist. I'm Presbyterian and ordained. And it was led by two women. It was summer, smaller crowd. And the language in the hymns and the scriptures was all male. And in the 70s and early 80s, that had all been repaired or fixed by the people who were on the staff then, but it went back the other way. And we see that in local churches a lot. You'll get a staff that or some lay leadership that really wants the language changed, and people will be careful about it. And then those people either die or leave, and it sort of goes back again. So it helps, like in the United Church of Christ, that the printed liturgies and a lot of the hymns are inclusive. In the Presbyterian Church, it's sort of like you get to make more choices. And even some of our very progressive churches in North Carolina, the pastors are careful about saying people and he and she, and are likely not to say mankind when they mean humans. But the language about God is just terrible.
Well, I'll give you an example from here. When Water began more than 35 years ago, Jean Martinson, who's a Lutheran, was one of some of you might know Jean Martinson. She worked for the Lutheran Church on women's issues, worked in Geneva and so forth. And Jean was on our founding group of people and did a lot of work on inclusive and expansive language. Several decades later, we had a young Lutheran woman come from Gettysburg Seminary who was writing a church history paper about the language in the Lutheran Church and the work that Jean Martinson had done as a church history paper. And it was absolutely, as Jeanette Stokes describes it, I mean, there was no use of that language, even though they knew about it, there was no use of inclusive and expansive language, much less now any consciousness of, for example, using the term sibling rather than sister to be inclusive of our trans friends. So I think these are the things that are so compelling to keep doing this work, depressing in their own right as well, that we have made so little progress. But my goodness. You know.
Okay, I'm just going to jump right on in here because
yeah. Sherry, go ahead.
You can always mute me out. So I've got like a couple of different questions, but listening to you, Jeanette, and you, Dr. Hunt, and Gail.
Call me Mary, by the way, everyone else does.
Okay, Mary, thanks. So how political and to what extent does politics influence how the pulpit responds to women? Right now, we've had a very, very conservative administration in place. And a lot of progress that we might have made has unfortunately been reversed. And then another question I had to you, Gail, was as an ordained minister, what has been your perception of the barriers that you encountered in your leadership from the pulpit? What has been your acceptance or rejection by the people around you? So with my first question, how much has the politically charged atmosphere changed our progress or challenged it?
Someone else might have a more informed answer to that question than comes to my mind right away. But in terms of what your second question, the question to me again, remind me.
I wanted to know what your perception of the barriers were that you encountered from the pulpit, what you felt was your acceptance or rejection by the people around you, because I think that's really important to know, building on the progress we've made over the years to fight for the right to be in the pulpit.
I think in my experience, getting a foot in the door was the main thing, in the door of a particular church. So I found consistently that when I did get called to a church, especially early on, once I was there, any opposition that might have been there melted away. Once they got to know me, once they had experience of hearing a woman preach and so on. So it was the experience that overcame the barriers. My husband and I for years did, we sort of pioneered our way into co-ministry, partly to show the equality of male and female in the church. And so we were called first as co-pastors to a little church out in a village called Byron in Western New York. And the first or second week we were there, one of the elderly men, his mother died, and we needed to do the funeral. And he very explicitly, he was the only one in my experience ever, but he very explicitly said, no, he didn't want me to do the funeral. He wanted my husband to. And so we agreed to that pastorally. It wasn't a time to be arguing, and Anthony did the service. But that was the only time and the last time that kind of barrier ever came, even with him. When he got to know me, when he got to know a woman in the pulpit, that melted away. Just one very fast, funny story, and then I'll give others a chance to answer your political question. And that is that in the spring of my first year in seminary, Anthony and I had gotten quite close, and were actually looking at the possibility of marrying. He was a senior. And one evening in the spring, I happened to sit down in the refectory at the same table he was at. They were big round tables. And so some of his classmates, who were all seniors, were at the table. And one of them, named Gary, asked me the age-old question that I must have answered 150 times that year already. And that is, oh, what was I doing here? And what were my plans? And so I matter-of-factly, as we ate dinner, told Gary my plans for ministry and pastoral work and so on. And then after dessert, I got up and left to go to the library to study. But Anthony stayed, and Gary turned to him and said, do you know that woman very well? Well, Anthony was being very cool and private about it. And he said, well, I'm acquainted with her. And Gary said, well, be careful of her. She's really serious about this. She'll ruin your life. And later, Anthony came and found me in the library laughing his head off to report to me what Gary had said about that I would ruin his life because I was serious. So that's the kind of thing we were up against.
Wow.
Thank you. Well done. Anybody on the political question? Kendra?
Yeah, I might just say, I don't really have an answer. I'm not sure, but a recent book that might kind of give you some insight, Sherry, is called Jesus and John Wayne, written by Kristen Dumas. And I think that you might find that interesting and helpful.
Great.
I'll look for it. Thank you so much, all of you.
Anybody else on that one? And then I think we probably should close it up because we're getting to 2:30. Jeanette, did you have something? No. I want to thank everybody for being with us, and this was a lovely post. This is like the coffee hour, you know, sometimes the richest part of these experiences after the no, it wasn't in this case, but you know how that can sometimes happen. But lovely to chat with you, and so wonderful to have the Christian Feminism Today folks and the Water folks and the Center for Women in Ministry in the South folks together. And I think, you know, we really do have a much stronger network than we realize. And so any ways we can collaborate, I think, are to the good. So thank you so very much. And I look forward to the next time.